there is a topic that I definitely wanted to address that's been fairly controversial about Yoshi P and FF16. I am pretty sure a lot of you already know what it is, but I definitely would like to address it and talk about it and share some perspectives on it. It was an IGN interview. Exclusive FF16 developers open up about Game of Thrones comparisons, side quests, and representation. So, one of the questions that he was asked in here, POC representation, in regards to diversity in the game, can we expect to see black characters in Final Fantasy 16 or people of color, non-white characters in general? To clarify a bit more, there's been discussion around the trailers to date featuring mostly white characters, and I wanted to get clarity on whether we can expect the final game to be more diverse. Now, I've heard some people criticize this as a question being asked, because sometimes these questions are asked not with the best intentions. Sometimes these types of questions are asked to, like, get some kind of, you know, controversial thing that they can sensationalize and sell because it's gonna be like hot topic and all that. But other times these questions are asked because they need to be asked. And so we don't know what the intent was of IGN in asking the question. But I think that in general, given the way that articles are pushed on algorithms nowadays, it's probably good to have a little bit of skepticism and cynicism about that and always ask yourself, what is the intent behind these questions? But I still do think that the question does need to be asked. And Yoshi P should be able to answer any kind of question about his game and his product. So he said, this is a difficult question. I am going to read the whole thing. He had a very long response, but not one that was unexpected, seeing as diversity in entertainment media has become a much discussed topic as of late. The answer I have, however, may end up being disappointing to some, depending on individual expectations. Our design concept from the earliest stages of development has always heavily featured medieval Europe, incorporating historical, cultural, political, and anthropological standards that were prevalent at the time. When deciding on a setting that was best suited to the story we wanted to tell, the story of a land beset by the Blight, we felt that rather than create something on a global scale, it was necessary to limit the scope to a single landmass, one geographically and culturally isolated from the rest of the world in an age without airplanes, television, or telephones. So this was his first point, saying that, well, this is the design concept heavily features medieval Europe. I don't want to sit here and take apart everything he said before I'm finished reading his full reply, but I will just say off the cuff here that I thought this was pretty dumb reason. I feel like FF16 is not like medieval Europe, but we'll get to that in a minute. Due to the underlying geographical, technological, and geopolitical constraints of this setting, Valisthea was never going to be, realistically, as diverse as, say, a modern-day Earth. That does make sense. Or even Final Fantasy XIV that has an entire planet and moon worth of nations, races, and cultures at its disposal. Now, this I do understand. He wanted to create an isolated world. And so the isolated nature of this realm, however, does end up playing a large part in the story and is one of the reasons Valisthea's fate is tied to the rest of the world. Ultimately, we felt that while incorporating ethnic diversity into Valisthea was important, an over-incorporation into this single corner of a much larger world could end up causing a violation of those narrative boundaries we originally set for ourselves. Now, I feel like this was a thing that you could interpret a couple of different ways. I'm not sure exactly what he meant by this, because he says that they did feel like it was important to incorporate ethnic diversity, but they didn't want to over-incorporate it into this isolated environment. So is he saying that they did? Like, there is going to be some, but just not an over-representation of lots of different backgrounds? I don't know. I feel like you could take that either way. It's kind of vague there. So I don't really know what that means. Is they did feel like it was important, but they didn't want to over-incorporate it. So, take that however you want. The story we are telling is fantasy, yes, but it's also rooted in reality. Conversely, the Final Fantasy series of games have always inherently dealt with conflict and struggle, especially between the empowered and those used or exploited by those privileged few, a prominent trend in human history. And a game that, by design, allows players to experience that conflict and struggle firsthand through dynamic, realistic battles, it can be challenging to assign distinctive ethnicities to either antagonist or protagonist without triggering audience preconceptions, inviting unwarranted speculation, and ultimately stoking flames of controversy. The best part of pulling inspiration directly from history, however, is that it allows us to revisit and re-examine our own past while also allowing us to create something new. So this is another thing that he's been pretty criticized for. Is the statement that for some, like, if you put in someone who is tan-skinned, who's just not pale, then this could invite criticism and controversy. You can see how that could make some people feel uncomfortable. That, like, okay, so just by someone looking like me in the game, that's gonna be political. That's gonna be a statement. That's gonna be distracting. You're not gonna be able to tell the story you want to tell. Like, that sucks to hear that. I don't see. Okay, well, let's just keep on. In the end, we simply want to focus to be less on the outward appearance of our characters and more on who they are as people. People who are complex and diverse in their natures, backgrounds, beliefs, personalities, and motivations. People whose stories we can resonate with. There is diversity in Valisthea. Okay. Diversity that, while not all-encompassing, is synergistic with the setting we've created and is true to the inspirations from which we're drawing. So here again, I think this ties back to what he said a little bit before. To me, I took this as, yeah, there will be some diversity in Valisthea. We don't know to what extent, but not all-encompassing, not every single kingdom, but maybe there will be, like, some diversity at all. Okay, like, not, I don't know. It's a little bit vague, and it was a bit of a word salad. It was a pretty long answer. But there was a couple things in here that I felt like he did get some valid criticism about. But before I get into that, I do just want to say off the bat that the knee-jerk reaction that some people had to this answer, like screaming that he's racist, has been really fucking obnoxious to read. Like, people who have been like, oh my god, he is racist. This answer is not okay. And, like, it's like pretending that you know what the developer's intentions were and interpreting this in the least charitable way possible, given everything that we know about Yoshi P, I think is pretty out of line. And I don't think that Yoshi P is racist. I don't think that he's creating a game to uplift white supremacy or any shit like that. I really don't. However, with that said, I definitely do think that there are a couple things in here that are worth discussing, and that from, like, thinking about representation in games overall, how it's talked about, and like some valid criticisms with the way that he talked about it, which was a little bit awkward. I do feel like a lot of these topics are just not discussed openly in Japan. Japan has been for much of its history fairly xenophobic. That's a bit of an ugly truth about Japan. And I'm not saying that people in Japan are racist. I'm just saying that, like, they don't always know how to navigate these conversations like we do in the West. A lot of this is new to them, and I think that he almost certainly doesn't know how to recognize his own biases and work on them. And that's something that he can and definitely should work on, and just think about in more reflectively, listen to the players' feedback, players who love his games and love him, but felt like a bit weird about what he said, and use it as a learning moment. I definitely think that he can. Now, some people have said that, well, this is his game. He's allowed to make any kind of game he wants. wants. He's allowed to make any kind of world he wants. It is a product, though. I think that's actually Joe Cat pointed this out. Joe Cat made a tweet about this the other day. In response to this, that I thought made a really good point, is that yes, it is a piece of art for sure, but it is also a product. Yeah, he said, okay, let me just read all of Joe Cat's reply. He said, the setting and lore are made up. It can be whatever you want it to be, and it isn't held back by any real-world limitations than what you choose. That's how fiction works. Real world doesn't have magic and marbles either. It's that way because you decide it. Yeah, the whole thing about the medieval stuff, I'll get into that in a second. That was a really stupid thing for him to say, I think. Before anyone says no, it does not mean calling him a sexist, racist, imperialist is okay. Just an unfortunate misstep by a stranger who makes games, and we, a consumer who buys his product. Joe Cat said he's not our friend, just a person who provides a service we can pay for or not. I tend to think about Yoshi P as a friend. I don't know if I can ever not do that. But I do think that he's someone who has some things to learn and some things to reflect on. Yes, he can make, just like we all do, by the way. Okay, I'm not singling him out. Like, everybody has shit that they can learn and they can reflect on, and like biases that they can address within themselves. Like, nobody's perfect, okay? And yes, he can make whatever he wants to make, and we're allowed to criticize it. He's allowed to ignore it. We're allowed to criticize that. It's a product, not a personal art piece, purely for self-expression. There's artistry in it, but feedback matters. And that's a really good point that he made in response to the people that said, oh, well, it's, you know, this is his artistic work and he can do whatever he wants with. Yes, he can. He absolutely can. But he should also expect the feedback from players and consumers who will buy this, and not be surprised by that. And I know that a lot of times criticizing Yoshi P is hard. Like, nobody wants to criticize Yoshi P. But sometimes doing that can be healthy, because it can be healthy for him, can be healthy for the games. Because I really do think, like, I genuinely do think Yoshi P just wants to make a game that people will enjoy and people will find fun. I really do believe that about him. And I don't think that he would ever intentionally, like, make a game unwelcoming or, like, make people feel like they shouldn't be playing it or anything like that. Because, well, again, he did say that there is diversity in it. It's just, so we don't know how much, but he didn't say no to this question. Another thing though, the myth about the whole argument that he made about the medieval European setting. This was honestly cringe for him to say that, because it's so stupid on the surface of it. Like, I guess I missed the part in medieval history where Joan of Arc transformed into Shiva, or the part where, like, did Charlemagne invent electricity by transforming into Ramu? That's so stupid. That's so fucking stupid. It's stupid, like, whether you agree with him or you don't agree with him, it's stupid in both ways. And then people have taken this and they're like becoming historians, and they're making all these, like, there's the people on one side who have been like, well, there was never any black people or no people of color in Europe at all in the medieval times. And then there's other people who are like, well, they were everywhere all the time. And I think that both of those were not true. But it doesn't matter. Like, we shouldn't have to study history to justify someone who is tan colored to be in a fantasy world. And maybe there aren't. Maybe there aren't. We don't know that there's not. I think that there might be. People have been like, well, there's the desert kingdom, and it's very sunny there. So it makes sense that if it's very sunny there and there's people who live there, then they're probably more tan. So, I mean, probably that would make sense. That would make sense. Is that the case? We don't really know. But the whole thing about this is extremely stupid. But the other thing that I would take more of an issue with personally was the idea in here that any tan or darker skinned character could be disruptive to the narrative. That it could be it could stop you from telling the story you want to tell. Now, this makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to you. If you've played Final Fantasy XIV, you know that's complete bullshit. This is a game that Yoshi P operates. He operates Final Fantasy XIV, which has one of the best narratives of all time in games. It's why I really felt like, what the fuck is he saying in this? What is he saying? But we have F14. There's a ton of amazing characters that are darker skinned, like we just had, and even some new ones in the more recent patches. Like we have Ericthonius, I think La Habrea, like Hephaestus. He said it's an over-incorporation into this single corner of the world. That is what could mess up the idea that this is an isolated area. So I don't want to like twist what he's saying, but I guess it's something that I think people have heard in other contexts, and that's another reason why people have reacted so badly in a lot of cases to it, is because I actually recently watched Rings of Power. There was a big discussion about this with Rings of Power. A lot of people, there were people who were upset. Now, you can criticize Rings of Power for like not being true to the source material and all that, but all that aside, there were people who were really upset that an elf would be black in that show. And there were people who were like really awful about that and were just straight up racist about that. And it was pretty fucking gross. And I watched the show. I thought that he was absolutely amazing actor. I loved Rings of Power. I loved the role that guy played in the show, and I loved all the diversity that was in it. I didn't feel like it took away from the narrative at all. I really enjoyed it. It was awesome. I had a great time watching that. And so to me, I felt like that, it's just, it sounds like bullshit to me. The idea that someone is not the right skin color, can't tell your story, that's stupid. That's bullshit. But I don't want to just say like my own opinion. I also wanted to share some opinions from other people in the community. This is a rather long video, but it's really good, and I definitely feel like I should play it.
Hi,
okay.
I go by the name Gigabyte Online or Terabyte in Final Fantasy XIV. I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV since June of last year. I've clocked around 2,600 hours in it since then. I think it's genuinely one of the best experiences that you can have in gaming.
Numbers.
And I have a lot of respect for Yoshi P and everyone that has a hand in developing the game and fostering the community. Almost everything in game, from like dialogue to the way that high-end content is handled to even the way that the development team consistently communicates with the player base. To me, it really shows that they're putting a lot of effort in, and I really appreciate that. I think it's gone a really long way towards creating a community that I really enjoy being a part of. No, yeah. I'm not saying that to...
That's true. You know, Yoshi P gets a lot of love from us, from our community, for being so open and being so straightforward and always communicating any kind of problems that are going on. We always felt like we have this direct line to Yoshi P, and like he's really in tune with our thoughts. And I think that's one reason why it's important for us to talk about these things, that like how players perceive some of these things, so he can take it into account in creating the games that we all love.
Leading to like a heavy-handed explanation on why a specific portion of Yoshi P's recent interview with IGN has betrayed my trust, and that everyone that works with him should be ashamed, or like whatever. When I say that I appreciate the work that Yoshi P and the people around him put in, I'm saying that straight. I'm doing it to give you context, which will make a lot more sense when we get to the subject matter. Recently, IGN held an interview with the development team for the upcoming game Final Fantasy 16 regarding what players can expect from the game, and a lot of these questions were what you would expect out of an interview of this type. Yes.
You said, didn't Yoshi P take over FF16 later if you already had the design set? Would you rework that after? I'm not sure exactly when he took over control of FF16. First of all, it's true that he's not a writer for the game. He probably didn't do the conceptualizing for the game, but we don't know how much of a role that he did play in that. And finally, I do want to reiterate that I'm not convinced that there is zero diversity in Valisthea. He definitely says there is diversity in Valisthea. He just said that they didn't over-incorporate different groups. And we don't know what that means. They said they wanted to incorporate some, but we don't know to what extent. It doesn't matter, because it's still good to have this discussion about, you know, why it matters. Okay.
Certain elements allude to past games. No, there won't always be a parallel to past games. Standard stuff. But what's gotten a lot of people talking is the specific excerpt from the review regarding a question about the inclusion of black characters or characters representing people of color by Naoki Yoshida, known as Yoshi P, the producer of Final Fantasy 16, as well as the lead director of Final Fantasy 14. To quote the interviewer, in regard to diversity in game, can we expect to see black characters in Final Fantasy 16 or people of color, like characters in general? To clarify a bit more, there's been discussion around the trailers to date featuring mostly white characters.
Sarkek, he said, nobody's against diverse characters. There are some people who unfortunately are. I don't think that Yoshi P is one of those people. I don't think he's against diverse characters. No, I don't think he's racist or anything like that at all. That's not the purpose of this discussion. People are against diverse characters where it doesn't make sense. An isolated continent will not be diverse. Japan wasn't diverse before it opened either. I think you'll find that this guy agrees with you in that. So just hear him out.
And I wanted to get clarity on whether we can expect the final game to be more diverse. Now, unfortunately, in the current day and age, asking questions like these about how we can expect the characters in the media that we consume to appear, it's fairly uncomfortable. A large part of that stems from the fact that it's not uncommon for questions like these to be used for motives that aren't exactly admirable.
So I really I respect the fact that he acknowledged the question and like the motives behind the question. Like, obviously, as I said before, I think it's good that like Yoshi P should be able to answer any kind of question, but with media today and the way algorithms work, it's hard not to be cynical about the reason why they would choose a question like that. And it might not always be because, oh, they really care about having the representation in games, but more like wanting to have the sensationalist headline that they can push, right?
Media today is filled with a lot of questions like these that are asked for seemingly benign reasons, but have the secret intent to sort of rile up the readers and draw engagement to the page, and you get it. Having read this article, I don't think this question was asked with malicious intent. Whether you agree with it being asked in this context or not, the fact of the matter is that this is a question that touches on something that a lot of people care about in the modern day and age. I won't say there's no way that I could be wrong, but I currently have no reason to believe that it was asked with the intent to like defame anyone on the development team. That being said, I'm still fairly disappointed in the response. Reading Yoshida's full response would be too long for the purposes of this video.
We already read it.
To summarize it.
We already read the whole response anyways.
The full excerpt will be linked in the description. What I took from his response is that when creating Valstia, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, the landmass that the plot of Final Fantasy 16 takes place in, instead of a global setting, in order to best express their narrative, they focus on one that takes place on a single landmass whose inhabitants are fractured, blighted, and isolated. And from the beginning of the development, aspects of medieval Europe were a huge focus due to the standards of the time being fitting for the story that they wanted to tell. While incorporating ethnic diversity was important, they felt that including too many aspects of different cultures would break the boundaries they'd set for themselves, in turn weakening the story that they wanted to tell. Instead of people focusing on the outward appearances of the characters, they want them to focus on the inner complexities and what drives them to be who they are. If I look at this from the standpoint of someone trying to create a narrative, in all honesty, I don't see a lot wrong with it. They wanted to tell a specific kind of story, and to do so, they leveraged aspects of fiction as well as historical accounts from a period of time that matched their vision. They focused less on outward appearance and more on character motivation. I don't think this response is worded, thoughtless, or lacks tact. And on top of that, from the position of a producer talking about a game that's already done, this is a pretty hard question to answer.
Yeah, it's already done.
Acknowledging all that, I'm like still pretty disappointed in the response. I think there's a common misconception that comes up when the topic of including black character traits is brought up, not just in video games, but in media in general. People tie the idea of including traits like dark skin or curly hair to the representation of ethnicity. And by extension, when stories are based on cultures of a specific time period and region, they naturally wouldn't include references to cultures that wouldn't be present in that time and region. But like, that's the issue, or at least it's my issue. I can only really speak for myself, but my problem with the lack of black representation isn't one that stems from not representing a culture that I identify with. If you're writing a narrative on 17th century Spain, I don't really want you to incorporate aspects of 20th century America just because. Like, you have reason to, that's fantastic, but otherwise it wouldn't make sense and it would probably diminish the narrative. But the problem with the lack of black representation in media isn't a problem of ethnicity, because black is not an ethnicity, it's a race. To belong to an ethnicity is to belong to a social group that has a common national or cultural background. So like, think of Japanese, Hispanic, Hawaiian, you get it. Whereas to be a certain race is to be defined by physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. So you can think of like white, black, Asian, so on. And to be very clear, I think the concept of race itself is moronic, but unfortunately, it is the best that we have right now. As an example on why it's important to separate the two and to get my point across, without using the word black, what words would you use to describe me based on my appearance and the way that I speak? If this video reaches more people than I'm expecting it to, especially if it reaches people who reside in the same country as I do, I would expect a lot of you to use the phrase African American. And if you did, you'd be wrong. I'm black, but I'm not African American. I'm like entirely Hispanic. The majority of my relatives on both sides of the family for like the last 2 to 3 generations were born in Spanish-speaking countries in the Caribbean. I was born in the US, but most of my family doesn't even like to live there. Anyone familiar with the Caribbean cultures? That really isn't a surprising statement. Someone can have dark skin like mine or curly hair like mine and not be considered black, but because of my specific combination of traits, I fall into that category. But if you're not from a part of the world where knowledge like this is common and well understood, it can be pretty hard to grasp. This is a concept that I struggled with a lot when I was younger, and like, I'm black, so I understand where people were coming from when they get things confused, but it's still upsetting. In the US, black and African American are used interchangeably. People expect me to identify with certain things and act in a specific way because I look like people who come from a specific place in their minds. And I get shit from both sides of the aisle for it. In my country, a lot of non-black people discriminate against me because of the color of my skin, obviously. But a lot of black people discriminate against me because I sound white.
He's not just explaining what racism is to normal people. What he's doing is illustrating the difference between ethnicity and race, and how there's a difference between the cultural and geographical background that you're from, like your ancestry is, and just your physical outward appearance. And so there's no reason why in a game like FF16 that there wouldn't just be some people with a little bit different outward appearances, that they're not all pasty pale and white. It doesn't mean that like they all have to be like there has to be a ton of Asian people, there have to be a ton of black people, there have to be a ton of, it's not saying that. It's just saying that in the places where that would make sense. Like if it's a desert and it's really hot and people are getting the sun all the time, well, maybe they should be more tan in that situation, right? Anyway.
I like can't win. People expect me to exhibit certain social traits because of my physical traits, just like how in media, people expect characters to exhibit certain social traits because of their physical traits.
Yeah.
But both of these expectations are wrong because physical traits do not account for culture.
There you
When
go.
we get like really specific about it, yes, black people share a common ancestor, but that doesn't mean that they themselves come from a specific place or act a specific way. In all likelihood, they don't even take from the same culture. Mind you, that's not to say that black culture doesn't exist, but it is to say that black culture doesn't simply stem from one location. Black culture is a culture that stems from people of similar traits and backgrounds being discriminated against for those traits. It's not a culture that stems from a physical location because, again, it stems from race, not ethnicity. And even then, that's not what most people are asking you to include when they ask you to include black characters and black traits. The point that I'm getting to is that when people ask for black traits and black representation in video games, like oddly enough, the majority of the time they only want you to go skin deep. We're not asking for like the token black character with the token black hair and the token black voice coming from the token black place or anything like that. We want skin tones that make sense. We want hair that makes sense. And yes, we'd love to see you include aspects of cultures that are predominantly black more often from the start, but we're not asking you to shoehorn things into a narrative just for the sake of diversity. Yeah. Because neither part...
That's another thing. That's another thing that I'm really glad that he brought up too. Like, diversity in games should not be treated as a check mark, like a quota, like this, like packaged and sold as a product feature. That's also really gross, and I feel like that's missing the point entirely. Like, what Activision Blizzard was trying to fucking do. Like, we've all seen it with their like graphs, their diversity graph, where like they check off, well, does this like what kind of traits does this person have that's gonna make them let's like have a different, actually let me find it. Blizzard diversity chart. Yeah, the diversity chart. It's creepy, it's weird, and it misses the entire point. Yeah, this of like body type, ability, age, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation. That's not, I don't think that's what I would be asking for. This definitely doesn't sound like what he's asking for. And it's weird.
wants you to diminish your narrative for just that. We want to feel included, and we want you to make sense. Because even if you look at it from a strictly logical standpoint, a lot of the time, characters not being black does not make sense. I was thinking about this a lot when playing through Stormblood in 14. Why is it that characters from areas like Thanalan or Girabanya, whose families have lived in areas that get beaten down by the Heartshun consistently for generations, why is it that they don't exhibit physical traits that would fall in line with people in the real world who live in similar conditions more often? Like in the real world, people who come from areas that are consistently exposed to a lot of sunlight are more likely to exhibit traits that make living in sunny environments easier, namely dark skin because darker skin protects you from sunlight, and curly hair because it likewise protects you from sunlight. The majority of the time in 14 and other games, they just sort of top out, you know? Like, they will give characters the lighter shades of brown, but they'll very, very rarely give them the darker ones. They'll give you the same over-the-top afro and ugly cornrows in every game, but they won't go, like, any further than that. And, like, it makes no sense. It makes no sense that people from proud countries with rich traditions like Ul'dah, Sildar, and Almigo don't exhibit these traits prominently and, like, don't even really seem to care about them. And coming back to the interview, I swear I haven't just forgotten about it to rant. You might be inclined to say, well, yes, that's a very good point for Final Fantasy XIV, but this interview is about Final Fantasy XVI, and unlike a story centered around sunny climates like Thanalan or Girabanya, 16's Valicia is based on medieval Europe, and placing black characters in the foreground of a setting like this wouldn't make sense. It would make sense for you to say something like that, but you would still be wrong if you said it. Because, like, even if that's the case, black people were not uncommon in medieval Europe. It takes like 2 seconds.
I think that is true in like the southern parts of medieval Europe. Probably the further north that you go, there would be less. Like I think northern parts would be there would be less non-white people running around. But they did exist. They were there. But in the southern parts, they were definitely well known. They were the Moors.
Seconds to look this up. There were merchants, captains, knights. Like, yeah, yes, obviously,
traders.
People that exhibit traits that signify that their genetic background stems from places that receive high amounts of sunlight would be less common in cultures that reside in areas with...
But again, the whole thing about the medieval shit, man, that's so stupid. Like, I wouldn't, there's no reason to get into that. And the whole, like, there's absolutely zero reason to engage with that point that he made at all, because it's a non-starter. There was not phoenixes in medieval Europe. There was not Ramu and Shiva and Titan run around medieval Europe at all.
Less sun, but like, newsflash, I'm about to blow your mind. Wait until about noon, walk outside to an open area, and this is the crazy part. Look up, 9 times out of 10, the sun's there. 1/5 of the Earth's landmass is desert. And yes, Europe doesn't necessarily have a true desert, but like, it's surrounded by places that do. Also, that doesn't even account for all the other environments that get a lot of sunlight. There are just a ton of places on Earth that are receiving a lot of sunlight every single day. And logically, if a lot of the planet is receiving tons of sunlight constantly, then a lot of places should be filled with people that look like they come from places that get a lot of sunlight constantly, but they just don't in media. They don't because instead of black traits, physical traits being tied to areas where they'd likely appear, or just like being common, because, you know, they're pretty damn common, they're tied to the idea that black traits come from black culture and black places. And that doesn't fit the narrative that I'm writing, and it isn't referenced in the historical text that I'm using, so I'm just not going to include it. The question, why should more characters be black, is asked commonly. But the correct question to be asking is, why shouldn't more characters be black? If they're this common and this prevalent, why are they not appearing more in media? Instead of being what they should be, you know, standard common as dirt for both characters and in-game customization, in the same way that brown and blonde and white hair is, not gray hair, white hair, black traits are commonly an afterthought, or seen as like an addition instead of part of the fundamental aspects of character building. When artists learn to shade skin, they'll blend together lighter skin tones beautifully. I've seen artists who can draw black skin really, really well, but they'll refrain from drawing black characters because they don't understand how to draw up curly hair. If you're going to create a person, a living being from nothing, taking the time to figure out their height, weight, build, stance, place of living, interest, so on and so forth, why are such common traits treated as being foreign? Why is portraying some genetic traits seen as more important than portraying others? Just like black people are erased from history, they're erased from media. Not actively, most of the time, The majority of the time, I don't even think it's done consciously or maliciously, but it still happens, just done passively. We aren't included because we're considered different or additional, when in reality, we've been here the entire time. We're everywhere, but in the media, a lot of the time, we're nowhere, and it doesn't make sense. I may not be getting my point across as eloquently as I'd like to, because it's currently 3 a.m. and I've been typing for 2 hours. In fact, look at the clock there.
I think that I think that he has done a really good job of getting his point across about, like, why aren't there more darker skinned characters in situations where it would make sense? Why isn't it more common? And he also acknowledged, it's not always done maliciously. It's not always done consciously. And I don't think that Yoshi is, like, assuming that there is no diversity in Valencia, which he did say that there was. We don't know the extent. I just want to clarify that again. But assuming that there is zero, I don't know if he is doing that. Like, I definitely do not think that he would be doing that consciously or maliciously.
Actually, 6:40.
I thought this was a fantastic video. It was a fantastic discussion about the difference between ethnicity and race, about things that maybe we should see more often than we do in gaming media. And I think that he extended a great deal of understanding and compassion to Yoshi P. Not acting like Yoshi P is out here trying to be racist or anything. There's another perspective that I wanted to share here before we leave this topic, and that was from our good friend, Brian Ricardo. So Brian Ricardo is the PvP guy in Final Fantasy community. He's been amazing. I did interviews with him in the past. He helped me learn how to be better at PvP. He's well-loved and appreciated person in our community, and he shared his thoughts on this as well that I wanted to share. He said, "This is an unfortunate read. I love the Final Fantasy series. It's been a big part of my life, and I think Yoshi P is awesome. However, let me try to explain why this is bad. Medieval setting is a silly reason." This was the worst thing that Yoshi P said. "In a world where people ride on yellow birds." Yes, it was very stupid for him to say that. "The developers have a chance to create any type of world. It's an executive decision to make a world of characters with European beauty standards as their main cast. It's done even in games without the medieval settings. It's about money and not taking risks. Let's face it, if the world was like a fantasy version of Africa or the main character happened to be a brown-skinned person, how many people would say woke culture or forced diversity? There's no win in this situation because people actively fight against diversity. People who vocalize that they don't care are not helpful to changing this standard. I heard a big streamer say they'll probably have side characters or DLC for diverse characters in the future. That's how normalized it is, brown people being side characters. So please try and understand what people are saying on this topic. Instead of saying things like, Japan doesn't understand the Western world, they clearly do. That's why it is like this. This is about wanting better for Square Enix because in reality, the world is diverse. So yeah, that's it. It's a complicated issue. There's some nuance to it. It's easy to get upset about it. It's been controversial, but I think that if you just cool your jets and think about it in terms of like, how can, in general, in game media overall, without getting hung up about FF16 in particular, or hung up about Yoshi in particular, like how could we see worlds that are better reflecting what would make sense, that is common for us to see in the real world, right? The last thing I'll say about this is that this is something that matters a lot to me because I grew up in a part of the world where racism was prevalent, and I mean hardcore fucking racism, like most people have probably never seen in their lives. I grew up in a part of the world where like the KKK was very active, where they were passing out flyers at people's houses, where people would brag that their grandfather had a KKK robe and stuff like that. So I know how ugly it can get. It's fucking disgusting to me, and that's the reason why I pay closer attention to these kinds of issues. With that said, I do want to clarify for the millionth time that it's good to have compassion and like not just fly off the handle with knee-jerk reactions anytime anything is like vaguely touching the issue of race and say, oh, that person is racist. Okay, Yoshi P is not racist. He's not. And Square Enix is not racist. I do not think that they are. I really don't. And the people trying to say that are way off base. That's all I want to say about that. I'm done talking about it.